Hey there, everybody, it's me, your buddy Dave, the host of the Dark Stuff channel here on YouTube. Here I am in the bunker contemplating my country's questionable future after our election the other day. But hey, let's celebrate American bands, right? So I have seen this thing going around for the last week or so, the top 15 or the top 20 or the top 25, whatever, top American bands. And I've seen a bunch of them and have thought they were all pretty interesting. I found a couple of those sort of puzzling. And they were puzzling in the sense not of what they chose. It's subjective. Anyone can pick whatever they want. But why the explanation that they offered for why they chose the ones they chose. Like in some cases, they were like, well, these aren't my personal favorites, but these are the ones that I think represent the blah, 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 blah. I mean, I was like, well, why don't your personal favorites represent something? I mean, why don't they count as the best American bands? Like, why are they your favorite if you think somebody else is better? Like, if you genuinely believe like Styx is a better band than the Allman Brothers, but you think Allman Brothers is more representative of what you should put so other people will agree with you in the video, but you genuinely think Styx is better, why wouldn't, I mean, I don't know, just throwing those out there. Let's do my top 15, okay? And I will admit, I didn't labor over the choices for a really, really long time. I did this rather quickly. I made a list of about 20, 25, and then I clipped a few out. You're going to notice a few obvious ones that I missed or something. I mean, but whatever. It is subjective, and let's dive into this. Let's see what you think. At number 15, Jane's Addiction. Jane's Addiction defined a decade before the decade actually happened. So in other words, Jane's Addiction, starting in 1987, was making music that was what was the future, what was going to be coming out in the 90s. They were doing it years ahead of time. They were mixing hard rock and psychedelia and funk and punk and avant-garde music and all sorts of things. And they put it into this stew with four members with very, very volatile personalities, and they made some incredible music in those first couple of years. You can talk about whatever they've done beyond that. That's you can have your own take on that. My take is I think the first three records were all that is that you need with Jane's Addiction. The live record, Nothing Shocking that I showed you, and Ritual de lo Habitual. They're my choice for number 15. My choice for number 14 in Greatest American Bands is Aerosmith. I think they have to be on anyone's list, or at least in my opinion, they should be on anyone's list. They are the American Rolling Stones to a very real degree. They are America's just straight ahead rock band. And I have to admit that I kind of, I grew up in the 80s, and I was there for Aerosmith when they were making their comeback with like Done with Mirrors and Permanent Vacation and whatever. But I had kind of grown tired of Aerosmith. I stopped paying attention to what they were doing in the mid 90s, and it was just like they were part of the past. And I'm okay with feeling that way. When they announced their retirement earlier in the year, it did strike something within me, and I really did kind of go back and start looking at Aerosmith again and really realizing my love for them was still there. I did a video about their Draw the Line album, and, I did get sad about the whole retirement thing, and it made me realize how important Aerosmith is to me, to my growing up, whatever, and to American music. That's why they're my number 14 of Greatest American Bands. Number 13 is Soundgarden. Here's their album Ultra Mega OK. This is the original SST version. Soundgarden, I'm still understanding the impact that they have had. They were kind of my generation's Led Zeppelin. I told people that, kids growing up in my era, what they learned on guitar when they were learning guitar was like a lot of Led Zeppelin, a lot of stuff off Led Zeppelin 4. And when Soundgarden put out Super Unknown, I was like, this is the Led Zeppelin 4 for this generation. That kids are going to grow up learning how to play guitar from that album. Soundgarden was such an amazing mix of some of the classic. You had Zeppelin, you had Black Sabbath, but they were very much influenced by punk rock too. So it didn't make them sound retro or a throwback or whatever. It made them completely unique. I was fortunate enough to see Soundgarden a couple of times back in their heyday in the 90s, and I saw them about 6 days before Chris Cornell died as well. Still pretty unbelievable that happened, but man, you know, talk about a band that just when you put all the parts together, it was just so fascinating. I never really got much out of Chris Cornell's solo music or Audio Slave or any of that stuff that he did outside of Soundgarden, but you can't touch every single Soundgarden record. They're all fantastic, and that's why they're such an amazing American band. Okay, coming in at my number 12 choice for the 12th best American band is the Minutemen. This is my CD of Double Nickels on the Dime. I didn't have any Minutemen vinyl. I was kind of surprised. I surprised myself with that one. The Minutemen are one of the most unique, incredible bands of all time. I recently watched a video where a guy was talking about greatest double albums, and I was expecting him to put in some just like the typical boring, everybody else says the same thing. And he put Double Nickels on the Dime as the number one double album, and I was like, this guy gets it. If I remember who he is, I'll put the link below. The Minutemen mix punk and funk and 70s hard rock and jazz and avant-garde and just whatever, all sorts of stuff, beat poetry, you know, whatever, into their music, and it's impossible to describe. It is the true definition of what punk is, which is just complete free expression, but so many people have this kind of narrow definition of punk, which involves it sort of sounding a certain way, and then they sort of reject, it doesn't sound like punk or whatever. But anyways, I've given up on debating what is and isn't punk. It's kind of like a silly, thing at this point. But the Minutemen and their follow-up band, Firehose, after D. Boone, the singer and guitar player in this band, died, are both really, really important. But I had to pick one, and so I chose the Minutemen. They are my number 12. I don't think it would be right to talk about the greatest American bands unless we're talking about the Stooges or Iggy and the Stooges. I will count either one, okay? Those first three records, the first two as the Stooges, the third one as Iggy and the Stooges, are the foundation of punk rock. We could quibble on who was actually the first punk band, but let's just say these guys are up there. Iggy Pop as a solo artist, legendary, but we're talking about bands. The Stooges just did it from nowhere. I mean, they just came up with this stuff without any other reference point. This album, Funhouse, is such a fucking masterpiece. Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
I'm feeling good. I'm feeling so fine. Into tomorrow.
And as a companion to the Stooges, at number 10, I've got the Velvet Underground. This is White Light, White Heat. It's from my box set of all of their original albums. The Velvet Underground and the Stooges and really the MC5, but they kind of invented what is punk. I mean, I'm sorry, you can say it's the Ramones, you could say it's the Sex Pistols, you can say whatever you want to, but you're wrong unless you say it was the Velvet Underground, the Stooges, and the MC5. So the Velvet Underground just mixing the avant-garde, the beat poetry, in some cases traditional rock. They mix it with noise and just completely unique ways of playing their instruments and such. And I know some people prefer the John Cale era on the first two albums, and that stuff is great. But I kind of like the second two albums, like the self-titled album and the fourth one. I kind of like the poppier Velvet Underground. I think that's ultimately been more influential, I would say, on future music. But it's hard to ignore the fact that those first two albums were awfully important and influential as well. Okay, at number 9, Rockford, Illinois' finest, Cheap Trick. Here's a copy of their self-titled, their debut. Cheap Trick are just such a significant band to me. When they came out, they were pretty much the hard rock Beatles. I know there were other bands that were aiming for that tried to make themselves out to be the hard rock Beatles, but it was Cheap Trick that actually was. The Rick Nielsen's incredible songwriting, his flair for pop melodies, the amazing voice of Rob Zander, perhaps the best singer in the history of music. I will die on that one. Bunny Carlos, perhaps the greatest rock drummer. We don't know. There's so many, but he was just fantastic. And of course, Tom Peterson. Who else plays an 8-string bass? Nobody. That's why Cheap Trick deserves it. But honestly, pretty much every album they made in the 70s, even into the 80s. I mean, I did a video on Cheap Trick in the 80s where I pointed out that a lot of their albums that get really slagged in the 80s are really not that bad. But just an incredible band who's been on a renaissance the last couple of years. They've made like 2 or 3 pretty good records. So Cheap Trick, the number 9 greatest American band. And then at number 8, I'm choosing REM. There's Fables of the Reconstruction. Aside from completely redefining what is Southern rock, because prior to that, Southern rock was considered basically like the Allman Brothers or Leonard Skinner or stuff like that. And you cannot deny these guys are from the South. They're from Georgia, and they made their own form of Southern rock. They virtually defined the 1980s. They created what is now known as college rock or whatever. And that wasn't even their biggest decade. The 90s was technically their biggest decade, where they dominated the pop charts, where they had, 5, 6, 7 million selling albums like Automatic for the People. And it's just like, what an incredible run. And their stuff, in my opinion, was good all the way up till the end. I mean, I know they had some spotty stuff maybe in the early 2000s, but they were working it out, after Bill Berry left. They needed to kind of figure out, how do we work in this new sort of environment? So I gave them a couple of years to work that shit out, Okay, my choice at number 7 is Van Halen. Okay. Earlier, I said that Jane's Addiction defined the 90s, but they did it years before in the 80s. Van Halen did the 80s years before. Okay, they took hard rock, which had been an exclusively like stoner burnout guy sort of thing, and they turned it into something that was all over the pop charts, and without sacrificing any of what made hard rock and heavy metal so great. Those songs are so fantastic. You have perhaps the greatest rock guitar player in music history with Eddie Van Halen. But the reason why Van Halen is not a boring shredder band is because of David Lee Roth, because his influence is so significant and his background is so different from a typical rock and roller. His love of all sorts of like vaudeville and showbizy kind of stuff and 60s pop is different than what most of the hard rockers were like, and that's why Van Halen was so unique. Now, I don't have any interest in Van Halen once Roth left. I didn't like Van Hagar. I didn't like the Gary Sharon record. I loved the Different Kind of Truth when Roth came back. So Van Halen is my number 7, but I qualify that by saying I want the original lineup only. I don't count Hagar. Coming in at number 6 is Nirvana. I think they are absolutely one of America's greatest bands. I think if you're leaving them off of your list, you're jaded and bitter about the 90s or whatever, because that band did so much in such a short time. They were so incredible. Every single song they released while Kurt was alive. I'm not talking about some posthumous demos and stuff that are a little suspect, but whatever. Every song that they released was killer. The entirety of Bleach and Nevermind and In Utero, all incredible. They did change the music business. It changed back, but that's okay, because very few bands, even bands that have like a massive album and whatever, they didn't change culture. They didn't change an entire industry. Nirvana absolutely did. Okay, I won't accept the argument that they killed hair metal, because that's a stupid argument. But did they actually change the music business? Did they actually change culture? Were fashion models doing grunge ads, the grunge look and all that shit. Yeah, it did happen. It did happen. They did absolutely change the culture. The songs are timeless. They're still great. People are still getting into them now. I now hear Nirvana finally on classic rock radio. It's not this competition. Is it them versus Guns N' Roses versus Led Zeppelin versus whatever? You can play all of it. It's totally fine. Okay, we're now in the top 5. Coming in at number 5, my 5th best American band is Husker Du. Husker Du, they were the Beatles of punk rock. Their existence was very brief, 7-8 years at the maximum. They started one way, much more simplistic. By the time they ended, they were virtually unrecognizable from how they started. They did literally everything in music, more so than just their influence and their impact. I mean, Husker Du did a lot for music. I mean, they were incredible players. Bob Mould and Grant Hart and Greg Norton, all incredible players. They set an example, like other bands, for showing what can be done on an independent level. And then also that it's not the worst thing in the world when you've maxed out that independent level to go to a major label. 2 amazing singer-songwriters in the band. That's unique among most of this list. There's usually just the one. It was that competition between Bob Mould and Grant Hart that maybe broke the band up, at some point in 1987. But that competition also made them, the 5th greatest American band of all time. But honestly, one of my favorites ever is Husker Du. Coming in at number 4 is the Ramones. I know I sort of said something earlier that was like, if you say the Ramones are the beginning of punk rock, well, it's not because I don't love the Ramones. It's just I do things chronologically, and like the Stooges and Velvet Underground existed before the Ramones, so technically the Ramones couldn't have invented punk. Same with the Sex Pistols, but we're talking about American bands. The blazing fast speeds, the 50s style rock and roll that they turned into 70s punk rock. Just amazing. I mean, great lyrics, very funny often, very very topical in some cases, and then other times just, God, what a fucking unique band, Ramones. I'm saying they are my number 4. Okay, number 3 is going to maybe throw some people, but I don't care. I'm choosing Sonic Youth. This is their 1994 album, Experimental Jet Set Trash and No Star. And yes, it is signed by Lee Ronaldo and Steve Shelley, by the way. Sonic Youth, another band that was so impactful on the 90s, and they started doing their stuff in the 80s with the different tunings and all the noise that they were putting into. But the thing about Sonic Youth, even with all that chaos and all that noise and all that dissonance, was they had good pop songs underneath there. Like when Sonic Youth started getting a little bit less experimental into the 2000s, and they kind of had this sort of third wave sound, I love that stuff. That's why I thought they were, if it hadn't been for personal reasons, they could have kept going and even till now. I would say the 80s was their noisy experimental wave. The 90s was where they kind of defined grunge along with bands from Seattle. And then in the 2000s, when they sort of had their little bit mellower sound, but I don't like to use that really when I'm talking about Sonic Youth, but a little bit more of the controlled chaos. Like if you listen to like Sonic Nurse or something, talking about that sort of deal. The songs were still catchy. It still sounded very Sonic Youth. It just wasn't going to throw you with all the squonking of the guitars and all that sort of weird shit. They managed to make it still sound like Sonic Youth without, freaking out your neighbors and stuff like that. Here we are, folks, the top 2 American bands. My number 2 is The Replacements, Minneapolis's finest, the finest foursome from the Twin Cities. God, I can't even, if you've been watching my channel, you know how much I love The Replacements. I have a series of Replacements videos. I talk about everything they do, all of their reissues, all of whatever. They're just such an important band to me ever since I discovered them by walking into a record store and hearing this record where they were covering a different band that I liked, and I was like, oh, I'm going to go get that. Amazing songwriter in Paul Westerberg, All of the members of the band are characters. They're all super significant to the sound. I do feel like, fortunately, their catalog has now gone, they broke up in 1991. But ever since then, people have gone back and fondly looked at their catalog and rediscovered it and realized that, wow, how did we miss this? A lot of people, I think. Their reissues have done really well. The box sets or whatever, there's just a clamoring for replacements. Their reunion was incredibly successful. You could quibble whether it was a real reunion with only two of the guys, but whatever. I went twice. It was awesome. I loved it. So yeah, the Replacements are my second best American rock band. And coming in at number one, come on, you guys know this, is Kiss. Kiss is the greatest American rock band of all time. And let me explain why. Not only do they have amazing songs, all of their 70s records are great, especially the first 6 studio albums, and this is the 6th one, okay? They were also doing that sort of attempt to do a hard rock Beatles a la Cheap Trick. I think Cheap Trick achieved that more so. But, Kiss is more of my favorite. What gets lost in the discussion about Kiss so much is the music. I've heard Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley do interviews where they talk about, it's not so much about the music. It's the, branding or the merchandise or whatever. They say dumb shit all the time, but it is the music. They have a lot of great songs. They just also happen to have set the highest bar for a show that had been set at the time. If you go to a Lady Gaga show, it's probably more sophisticated than a Kiss show was, but Lady Gaga would say she got all that from Kiss. I think when you take their songs, the story of how they formed and how Gene Simmons was an immigrant from Israel and Paul Stanley was a nerdy Jewish kid with a messed up ear that from Brooklyn, and Ace Frehley was this sort of kid who used to get in a lot of trouble, and he was potentially a juvenile delinquent. Or Peter Criss used to get in a lot of trouble. He had these 9 lives, and he had this whole other musical history pre-Kiss that magically never got found out during the 70s. It wasn't exposed with pictures of him or whatever. The fact that they hid their identities was so interesting and couldn't be done today. It just couldn't be done when everybody has a camera with their phone and all of that stuff. The fact that they were able to successfully hide their identity for 10 years is pretty fucking impressive. Also pretty difficult to be one of the most famous people in the world and have a large chunk of them not recognize you. Now, sometimes you'd think like that'd be great. I can just go to the store and nobody's going to hassle me. But on the other hand, maybe you want to be recognized if you are a famous rock star. Maybe you'd like people to know. So anyways, these were my 15. Kiss is my number 1. They set the bar for everyone else. Again, hope you dug this. Thanks a lot. Leave a comment. Take care. Bye-bye.
So, you have a MySpace page or something?